Olá, sejam bem-vindos. Olá, sejam bem-vindos à Abralim ao vivo, Linguistics Online. Hello, welcome to Abralim Live, Linguistics Online. I am Márcia Machado Vieira, professor at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm glad to mediate a lecture in the sociolinguistic field and about homeland and heritage varieties. Today, I represent the Abralim Scientific Commission of Sociolinguistics, which aims to contribute to the policy of popularizing science. Participation as an associate of Abralim and a member of the commissions is essential to be done democratically and in appropriate forms. The Scientific Committee of Sociolinguistics is made up of professors from different universities and is coordinated by Professors Juliana Bertucci Barbosa from Federal University of Triângulo Mineiro, Uberaba, Minas Gerais, and Márcia Machado Vieira from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. It's an honor to collaborate in the series of talks in this virtual event, Abralim ao Vivo, Linguistics Online, designed for the exchange of ideas and organized by the Brazilian Linguistic Association in cooperation with important associations as Permanent International Committee of Linguistics, Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, Argentine Society of Linguistic Studies, Brazilian Association of Applied Linguistics, International Association of Applied Linguistics, Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistic Society of Europe, Linguistic Association of Great Britain, British Association for Applied Linguistics, Spanish Society of Linguistics, and Australian Linguistic Society. We thank all this association and the Abralim team for this great series of talks. Today, we are going to listen to Dr. Naomi Nagy. Naomi Nagy is a professor at linguistics at the University of Toronto. Her area is sociolinguistics, with particular interest in understanding language content through variationist sociolinguistic approach. She directs the Heritage Language Variation Change project, which examines variation in 10 languages spoken in Toronto. Goals include documenting cross-generational variation via digital recordings and time-aligned transcriptions of conversations, ethnic orientation questionnaires, and elicitation tasks. Cross-linguistic comparisons develop a generalized understanding of context-induced language change and helps push the field of variationist sociolinguistics to expand beyond its monolingually oriented core. She co-edited Socializing Languages, Sociolinguistics, and Multilingual Speech Communities. Maya Abitan will start the discussion in the question-answer session. The title of Dr. Naomi Nagy lecture is Exploring Variation and Change in Heritage Languages. Sure that we are going to enjoy it, I would like to invite the audience to type questions into the chat during the lecture. Professor Juliana Bertucci and Maya Abitan will help mediate the discussion in the chat of the YouTube channel during the conference. Dr. Naomi Nagy, it's an honor to count on your conference here. Thank you for collaborating into Abralim ao Vivo, Linguistics Online project. So now the floor is yours.
Obrigada, Marcia. Bom dia e boa tardes. And that's about the extent of my Portuguese. So I'm very pleased to be here. And I really would like to thank the organizers of Abralim ao Vivo because this has been a real lifeline. This year, it's been fantastic to listen to so many wonderful lectures, and I'm really honored to be presenting today. So I will just go right ahead and get started. I think I have my sound and my pictures all lined up. And I'm going to talk about exploring variation and change in heritage languages. And I'm particularly interested in the effects of language contact. And often we look at the effects of language contact in bilingual speakers, but we often examine the larger, better documented languages. And the question that I explore is what happens when we instead look at minority languages, and in particular at heritage languages spoken in the city of Toronto in Canada. Heritage languages, in turn, have been investigated quite a bit through experimental approaches, but in contrast, the work that I'm going to present today is findings about heritage languages as contact languages as explored through variationist sociolinguistic methods. So what I'd like to do in the next hour is to first discuss briefly how variationists look for language contact effects and why we do that, and then describe the goals and the methodology of the Heritage Language Variation and Change project, and then highlight findings on 3 of the variables that we've looked at across several of the 10 languages that are part of that project, and show you, and this is a spoiler alert, that the results actually show much less effective contact on the heritage languages than what we've seen previously from experimental results. And then place those findings in a bigger picture and talk about where we might go next with this knowledge. So first, let me just very briefly define the concepts of heritage languages and variationist sociolinguistics. Heritage languages are languages that are a person's mother tongue that is not the majority language of the community that they live in. However, in many studies of heritage languages have a narrower definition of being a language which has been incompletely acquired or partially lost or attrited by a speaker as they've switched to the dominant language of their community. For one example that's getting a little bit dated, but I think still representative, Olga Kagan in 2007 described a heritage language as being one which has limited vocabulary, incomplete morphology, impoverished syntax, spotty sociocultural knowledge, that would be, I guess, the speakers rather than the language itself, and a not fully developed register, in part because heritage languages are limited to certain contexts of use, which tend to exclude the more formal domains that we use language in. In a slightly different angle, some people also think of heritage languages as being defined in terms of what else the speaker can speak. So Sylvina Montrul in 2012 wrote that heritage speakers are people who have been exposed to their minority language since childhood and are also very proficient in the majority language. So a little bit odd to define being a speaker of one language by the fact that they are also a speaker of some other language. In Canada, in competition with these definitions, we also have a definition that's been provided by the government. And in this case, it has nothing to say about the ability or the proficiency of the speakers. A heritage language speaker is simply someone with a cultural connection to a language other than the 2 official languages of Canada, that is English and French. And they may have been born abroad or born within Canada. For the research that I'm going to talk about today, the HLVC project, it's important to note also that participants descended from speakers who acquired the language in the homeland, and that may be several generations back. And they are fluent enough to agree to participate in an hour-long sociolinguistic interview in the heritage language.
Excuse me, Naomi, I'm interrupting because you're not sharing your screen, and I think you would like to be, right?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Okay, let me see if I can find that button. Thanks so much. You guys just missed a few really cool graphics, but nothing too serious. Okay, now is it good?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So sociolinguistics is the field in which we analyze variable linguistic structures as opposed to categorical patterns. And sorry, I just need to rearrange my windows again. Okay, I think I can now see what I need to see. Okay. And we're also interested in how variation is associated to membership in particular social groups. And the usual suspects of these groups are things like region, gender, age, class, membership in particular communities of practice. But we're going to be adding into that when we look at language context situations, what degree of contact speakers have with each of the languages that they speak. And there are many different measures for those, and I'll talk about how we operationalize that aspect of it. So sociolinguists often look at just one language. They often look at speakers who are represented as monolingual, and the majority of the research in variation of sociolinguistics has focused on just a few very large languages. When we want to look at smaller languages, we necessarily are looking at language contact, and vice versa. When we look at language contact, we need to consider languages that are not the dominant languages in their community. And we might wonder why this would be important to do. One of the quotes that has really motivated me is this quote by Roland van Hout and the sadly recently departed Peter Muysken, who wrote at the end of a big study on contact-induced change that a lack of generalizability still plagues research on language contact. And they stress that their results are not meant to be independent of the particular set of languages that they examined. In other language pairs, quite different factors may turn out to be operant, depending on sociolinguistic factors and different contrasting typological properties. Well, that was 25 years ago. About 10 years ago, Seaman and Quintana wrote that predicting the outcome of language contact remains an immensely challenging task. And even more recently, Poplack, Zentz, and Dion wrote, "We are far from being able to identify a linguistic feature that can be predicted to change in all language situations." So we know that contact involves change in languages, but we still don't have a very clear understanding of what factors influence language change in what contexts. And in part, this has to do with the very different types of contexts that have been examined, and the very different methodologies that have been applied, and the very different pieces of the languages that have been examined, making it very hard to generalize across studies. So the Heritage Language Variation and Change Project attempts to get rid of some of those components of variation and apply the same methodology to look at the same parts of languages that are in the same situations and see whether we can reach generalizable conclusions about how contact-induced language change works. And another motivating factor is mobility. And Karen Beeman has put together a lovely set of quotes that I am co-opting a little bit here about the importance of looking at mobility at the more and more globalized world that we live in. And Peter Auer has noted that mobility has become such a central feature of human existence in the age of globalization that any kind of linguistics that is not able to address its effects will be in danger of falling out of step with reality. And David Britton wrote that dialect contact and death are inextricably linked, yet attrition doesn't necessarily lead to a wholesale shift to the standard language. While some dialects are receding, new varieties are emerging, molded by ever greater contact among speakers of different varieties on many scales. And so if we think about heritage languages, which are the result of mobility, the result of immigration to another country by a large enough number of people that the heritage language continues to be spoken, then we want to understand what happens in that context. And we want to consider the possibility that when language shift to the dominant language doesn't take place, what we might be seeing is the emergence of new varieties, new dialects of heritage languages. So in the same way that people now talk about Canadian English or Quebecois French as different from the European varieties, or Brazilian Portuguese as different from the European varieties, perhaps we are watching and able to document the emergence of Canadian Italian, Canadian Korean, Canadian Cantonese, etc. And we want to examine these languages in their own rights rather than always as a derivative or a derivative form compared to the homeland variety. And to kind of motivate the importance of thinking this way, I have just a few more quotes before I get into really talking about the research itself. To generalize from a lot of experimental work that's been conducted on heritage languages, we expect to see variation that suggests a consistent pattern of simplification or loss in that heritage languages are incompletely acquired. There's many careful research studies in heritage linguistics that show these differences via experimental work that considers the more attrited speakers of heritage languages. In contrast, we also have publications which show that heritage language speakers are not limited in their capacity to attain competence. So a heritage speaker can attain full competence just like a monolingual speaker. But even people who are on that path also comment that heritage language speakers differ from monolingual speakers in that they exhibit greater variation than monolinguals. And I kind of want to probe and pick at what we mean by greater variation. But what I'm going to show you is a little bit more on the right side option here, that heritage languages may in fact remain the same as the monolingual variety spoken in the homeland, or they may diverge. And so this can tell us a lot about contact effects once we have enough comparable studies to see whether we can generalize about when they diverge and when they remain the same. So that's the driving goal of the Heritage Language Variation and Change project. So following on work from, for example, Thomason and Kaufman, Shana Poplak, when we look for evidence of change, it's important that we consider both the pre-contact varieties and the post-contact varieties, and we bring them in careful opposition to each other. And we do that in this project via 4 kinds of comparisons. The first is that we look at we make intergenerational comparisons within a heritage language. So we compare the speech of immigrants, children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants, to see whether there seems to be change in the language. If we find evidence suggesting a change, then the next question is whether that change is contact induced. And in order to determine that, we want to compare the heritage variety to the homeland variety, the variety that's spoken in the country that people immigrated from, where although there may be some contact with English, there's certainly less than the speakers find in Toronto, in a city where half of the speakers are native speakers of English. If our comparison suggests that there's a change going on in the heritage variety that is not going on in the homeland variety, then we suspect it to be related to the to contact. But in order to determine whether that's the case, we also need to make comparison to the English spoken within the variety. And for this purpose, I'm very grateful that Nicole Hoffman and James Walker set up a project just before I started this project, looking at English of a variety of ethnic groups in Toronto. And so they have conducted sociolinguistic interviews and analyzed a whole lot of variables in the English of many of the same community groups. So we can make these comparisons and see whether there's really evidence for attributing the change that's going on in the heritage variety to contact with English, or whether it might be due to other factors, internal types of change. And finally, once we've established that for each of the variable patterns in each of the languages, then we want to make comparisons across the different heritage languages in the project in order to see if we can generalize about the types of change that are occurring in this context. So we have an expectation, and on this slide, the flags represent the homeland varieties of the 10 languages in the project. So you can see if you can work out where those 10 languages are spoken and give yourself a huge pat on the back if you can recognize all 10. So we have an expectation that first generation speakers, that is people who were born in one of those 10 places and arrived in Toronto as adults, will speak a variety of their language that is quite similar to that spoken in the homeland. And in turn, that second generation speakers, that is those people born in Toronto as children of the people who immigrated to Toronto, will speak a slightly divergent variety, a little bit different from the homeland. And that third generation speakers, that is the grandchildren of immigrants, will have diverged still farther from the homeland variety, but continuing along a consistent trajectory from first to second to third generation. And there's a further expectation that in addition to moving away from the homeland variety, speakers are also moving towards a more English influenced form of their heritage language. And finally, we expect to see some kind of a connection between involvement in the heritage language culture and ethnic orientation towards that heritage community and language shift. That is, the more that people who are more oriented towards their heritage culture rather than towards the broader Canadian culture will speak their language in a way more consistent with the homeland variety, while those who are not particularly oriented toward their heritage culture are the ones who may be more open to influence from English in their heritage language. So this is the expectation that we want to test. Toronto is a fantastic place to do this because half of the people living in Toronto immigrated from some other country, and half of them have a mother tongue other than English. And people in Toronto love to talk about languages, and they speak them much more freely than in many other North American cities. So anytime I'm out walking around, I'll hear people speaking other languages in Toronto. So Toronto, the greater Toronto area has a population of just over 6 million. And the 10 languages that are in the Heritage Language Variation and Change Project range from being the largest languages after English in Toronto in terms of mother tongue, to some very small languages, including one that's too small to appear in the census, but I'm not going to talk about that one today. So one of the things that we have is a range of sizes of communities that we can think about as a factor that may influence how language contact works. And incidentally, the languages in the project are color-coded, so you can see the color that is consistently applied to discussions of each language. And if you have a favorite language, you can follow along and just watch for those colors. So let me turn now to describing the way the Heritage Language Variation and Change Project works and what its goals are. We have both descriptive and theoretical goals. The descriptive intent is to develop a multilingual corpus for intergenerational, cross-linguistic, and diatopic comparison. By diatopic, I mean comparison between the homeland and the heritage varieties, in order to allow us to develop generalizations about the types of variable features or structures or rules or constraints that are borrowed earlier and more often in contact settings, and to use consistent methods across different languages and different variables. And we do this by documenting and describing heritage languages as spoken by immigrants and 2 generations of their descendants, and create corpora of transcribed, time-aligned, spoken, spontaneous speech in each of the languages that are available for research on a variety of topics. And we hope that by creating these corpora and making them available to other researchers, we can help to push variationist research beyond its monolingually oriented core and its focus on majority languages. 98% of the research in variationist sociolinguistics that's published is on English French, Spanish, or Portuguese. And that leaves 2% for the other 6,000 languages of the world. And even more, 80% of that is on English alone. And so we hope to see whether the generalizations that have emerged in the field of sociolinguistics are upheld when we look at languages that have less institutional support and are less well documented. And as an additional goal, we're hoping to promote the heritage languages' vitality by training students who are speakers of these heritage languages in research, training, and knowledge mobilization, both in the classroom and through various extracurricular activities. And so all of the work that I'm reporting on today is based on data collected by and analyzed by students who are heritage language speakers. And I'm very, very grateful to the work that they have contributed and to what they've helped me learn about their languages. And I'm pleased that some of them are listening today. The methods that we use, we focus in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, which is a space that's about 50 kilometers across. And we seek speakers who live in all parts of the city, members of different neighborhoods, different social classes, and not necessarily related to the university. And we do that by pushing outwards from the researchers' social networks. So this is a map that's on the HLBC website that has little voice clips of speakers and shows what neighborhoods they live in if people want to have a little listen. But in addition, once we started collecting data in Toronto, we realized that we were in many cases lacking a good homeland comparison of corpora of spontaneous speech to compare the heritage speakers to. And it was very important that we could compare the speech, the heritage language speech to data collected in the same manner and speakers speaking in the same context rather than some idealized standard variety. And so in addition to the data collected in Toronto, the field workers have gone back to their home countries or their families' home countries armed with recorders and microphones and conducted sociolinguistic interviews in most of the home countries of, that our speakers are coming from. For each language, we want a broad representation of speakers. So in addition to collecting data from 3 generations, within each generation, we collect data from speakers of a range of age groups, from young adult to as old as we're able to find, and try to balance that across gender. So we have, as a goal, 4 speakers representing each age by generation intersection. So 10 languages, 3 generations per language, 4 age groups per generation, 4 speakers per age group. About 400 speakers is our goal. These speakers vary greatly in terms of fluency, language usage, and ethnic orientation, but we'll talk about the measures that we have in place for considering the effects of those varying factors. And then in addition, about a dozen homeland speakers who obviously don't have generations since immigration as part of the sample design, so they can be a much smaller group. As I mentioned, all of the data is collected by students who are heritage language speakers. These are native speakers of their heritage language who have grown up for at least a good part of their life in Toronto and have nice connections into the community and are interested in talking to people and getting them to converse while being recorded for a research project. The participants are asked to participate in 3 tasks. The main one is the kind of a standard Lebovian style sociolinguistic interview, where the interviewer is attempting to find topics of interest to the participants to get them to chat in a relaxed and spontaneous manner, tell some good stories, forget that they're part of a research project, and also provide some information about their background that may be useful for understanding variation in the way they speak heritage languages. In addition, we also have participants conduct a short picture description task where they're asked to describe objects on each page of a children's book and then tell a little bit of a story about what's going on each page. And this provides data that's more easily comparable across speakers, since the same vocabulary items are elicited and the same types of sentence structures are often found. And this has turned out to be quite useful for training students in sociolinguistics of working with heritage languages. There are many, many students who have some fluency, but not total fluency in the heritage language that they would like to do research on. And it's much easier for them to find examples of particular variables in a slightly more controlled task like this one. The third task that participants are asked to do is an ethnic orientation questionnaire. And this is based on Hoffman and Walker's questionnaire for their project about English spoken in Toronto, which in turn is based on Keefe and Padilla's questionnaire that was used to look at Chicana speakers in the United States. And it has 37 different questions about how people orient towards their ethnic group and towards their language, what languages they use, what languages they like to use, and how much involved they are in the culture that is related to their heritage language. So we can think of these questions as being generally a way of seeing whether a person sees themselves as more, say, Korean or more Canadian, or Korean, Canadian, mixed, hyphenated, both, sometimes one, sometimes the other. The questionnaire is administered orally and in a kind of relaxed way so that participants can answer in a very open-ended fashion. But after they do that, then we score their responses so that a response that suggests a strong orientation towards the heritage language is given 2 points, a strong orientation towards English or Canada, 0 points, and 1 point for anything mixed and in between. And then we can use this information to see how this orientation score is correlated to the way they speak their heritage language. And the next question is then, is the same kind of correlation present in all of the different groups that we are investigating, or is this something that is more relevant to groups of a particular size or with a particular longevity in Toronto, or with a particular degree of similarity towards English? So the interviews and the picture description task are time-aligned, transcribed using Elon, which gives us a searchable text for finding examples of all of our variables. And we just use a standard orthography, kind of a rough pass. And then for each variable that we look at, we can do a more fine-grained transcription or acoustic analysis to see what kind of variation there is in the varieties, in the different languages. So as I mentioned, the goal is to have comparable studies across lots of the languages in order to see whether the same variable behaves the same way. So some of the variables that we have looked at are listed here. They run from phonetic through phonological, morphological, syntactic, and some lexical ones. On the right, it shows which languages we've already been able to look at a particular variable in. If anybody has suggestions of other variables that would be good to look at or that have been looked at in some of these languages in other places or using other methodologies such as experimental, please put them in the chat and we'll see if we can look at them at some time in the future. For any one variable, we use the comparative variationist analysis to examine what the variation is like. And what this means is that we may first look at the rate of use of the innovative versus the conservative variant for each speaker and see how that varies from generation to generation. But in addition, we're also very interested in looking at the grammar of variation, that is the constraint effects that is, or the way that different aspects of the linguistic context in which a form is uttered influence the pronunciation or the morphological structure that is selected by a speaker at a given moment. And the idea is to tease out the effects of any known linguistic and social predictors in order to control for the uneven distribution that we find when we collect our data from spontaneous speech, and then see what the effects are of the contact factors that remain after we've ruled out those issues of uneven distribution, in order to see whether we are truly seeing evidence of contact or even of change in the languages. And again, this work is conducted by students mostly at the University of Toronto, but currently also at about 5 other universities in various places around the world. So, so again, the idea is to see whether we see a pattern of change like this from generation to generation, and then to see whether that is related to ethnic orientation. And the way we want to do that is to compare the use of the linguistic innovative forms, which we sample from the transcribed speech, to the measures of ethnic orientation as calculated from the ethnic orientation questionnaire. And our expectation, our prediction, is some kind of a nice correlation like that, that the more towards one end of the scale a speaker is, the more they will use one variant or the other in a particular variable. I'm going to show you that it turns out not to be so clean cut as this. So let's look at a few of the variables that, that we've examined across several languages. And at the same time as presenting the patterns that we found, I'm going to contrast them with findings that have been previously reported for the same heritage languages, but using experimental methods. So a really popular variable to look at is voice onset time, because voice onset time differs across many languages and is a relevant signal for distinguishing sounds in many, many different languages. And so we, and in particular for most of the languages that are in the HLVC project, the voice onset times for syllable initial voiceless stops are considerably shorter than for English. So just super quickly, when we say a word like party and a phrase like it's a party in English, we have kind of a long aspiration on the P. We've measured it here in this spectrogram, and it's 6 milliseconds long. In contrast, and we refer to that duration as aspiration, and that also is the voice onset time measurement for that sound. In contrast, if we say something like l'altra parte in Italian, so we have a P in the same intervocalic and word initial stress syllable context, the aspiration or the voice onset time period is considerably shorter, 1 millisecond in comparison to the 6 milliseconds for English. Experimental literature has suggested that because of this difference, heritage speakers of at least Spanish and Korean in the United States did not perform like native speaker groups. So we have this sort of context to consider. A Homeland study conducted some time ago of Italian voiceless, word initial voiceless stop VOT values has ranges depending on place of articulation down here between 1 and 2 milliseconds. Data from Hoffman and Walker's Toronto English speakers has English voice onset time up around here. And so we would expect to see some kind of a pattern climbing from the Italian towards the English VOT from generation to generation. So the question is, do we see that when we look at spontaneous speech? Here are results from 3 of the languages that we've looked at. Russian is behaving as predicted, with each generation having slightly longer voice onset time, although notice that it's not getting up quite into the English range. Ukrainian, similarly, is increasing in voice onset time with each successive generation, although note that for Ukrainian, we have fluent 5th generation speakers, and even these speakers, although the English influence is notable in their accent, they're still not quite in the range of English. But the other really important finding from this study is that Italian behaved completely differently from Russian and Ukrainian. And so we can't say that this is a universal, that voice onset time is affected by contact with English. Just to clarify here, we can juxtapose the heritage language results, which are shown in the bar graphs by generation, to the trends for the homeland speakers that were independently collected. And we can see that all of the heritage speakers, even in the 3rd generation, remain pretty close to the homeland variety rather than getting into the English range. But we also see that there's variability among the speakers, and particularly by the third generation, there's a fair degree of variability that's represented by these wider confidence intervals. And so the next question that we want to ask is it the case that some speakers are maintaining a more Italian-like VOT while other speakers are hitting the English targets? And when we look at group averages, we're just seeing something in between because we have speakers of both types. And so if that's the case, then we want to see what might distinguish those speakers. And we turn to the ethnic orientation questionnaire. We've grouped the 37 questions into 5 categories of different types, questions about different aspects of the speaker's background, the languages they choose to speak, the cultural environment that they live in, the languages that they actually speak as opposed to prefer to speak, the cultural choices that they make, such as whether it's important to them to live in a neighborhood with other Italians, or whether they think Italian speakers should marry other Italian speakers, and also whether they have been victim to discrimination because of speaking the language that they speak. The first thing we did was check how correlated those different factors are to each other, because it would be nice to be able to simplify the ethnic orientation. And if we found the measure of ethnic orientation. And if we found that these scores were all highly correlated to each other, then maybe we could look at just 1 or 2 of them. In fact, these correlation values, our scores, are all quite low and not significant, with one exception. But what we want to focus on here is the lack of significant correlation between any of these ethnic orientation scores and the voice onset time measurements. And these emerge from investigation of 114 speakers across 3 of the languages. So for the Russian and the Ukrainian cases where we did see some change, we might interpret that as influence from English, but we might also consider the possibility that it's a change motivated internally or just by some other reason. And Carrera and Potowski have framed it this way. They point out that some scholars object to the use of the term incomplete acquisition to describe the grammatical behavior of heritage speakers, preferring the sociolinguistic view that heritage speakers' language is different without any implication of deficiency. That is, that heritage speakers indeed are just speaking a different regional variety. And I think that my fellow Canadian English speakers around me would agree that their variety is simply a different regional variety from British English, and rather than being a deficient variety based on incomplete acquisition of the language. So we want to offer that same explanation and see whether we can support it with evidence for these other languages. Those claims were based on examination of structural characteristics of Spanish in the United States. So that's Carrera and Potowski's sociolinguistic view. Montreal, from the heritage language field, critiques it, saying that what makes it difficult to see the language of heritage speakers as a variety of its own is that there are clear proficiency effects, that is, correlation with how proficient they are in the language. And if that's the case, then it does seem like language contact would be the responsible interpretation of the pattern. If speakers who are less proficient are the ones who are, for example, showing higher voice onset times, then it does seem to be connected to how much they use English instead of their heritage language. So we wanted to look at that. However, we didn't have any built-in measure of proficiency for our speakers. We simply selected speakers who were fluent enough to be able to participate in an hour-long conversation. But we looked to work by Polinsky, who suggested that speech rate can be quite a good measure of proficiency. So on this graph, each shape on the graph represents a single speaker. and the different shapes are different generations, but you can see it doesn't matter what generation they are. On the x-axis, speakers are graphed according to how quickly they speak, with faster speakers on the right. And on the y-axis, their average voice onset time, with the more English-like voice onset time, the longer ones going up. And we've mapped them according to their random effects from a mixed effects model for each speaker. So that's why the numbers, the scales don't really make a whole lot of sense. And there's no strong correlation between these two measures, speech rate and voice onset time. What we would have predicted, according to the experimental literature, is some kind of a slope like this, where the faster the speaker, that is the more proficient speakers, would have a lower voice onset time. And absolutely, we don't find that for the Italians. We did the same sort of thing for Russians, and the correlation, the regression line that shows up in that data just also goes straight flat across the graph. So we have, even for a language that is moving towards more English-like with each generation, it is not the case that the slower speakers are the ones who have the voice onset time that is more English-like. So we find here a divergence between experimental studies and corpus-based research. But we returned then to Montreal's critique of the idea of thinking of this as simply difference rather than deficiency. And if we read on, we see that she says that heritage speakers with the lowest levels of proficiency in the language are the ones who have reduced vocabulary, basic word order, and make morphosyntactic errors with case, gender agreement, and other morphology. So we thought, okay, maybe what we should really be looking at is morphosyntax rather than phonetic patterns. And so we turn to case. The methodology for these next two variables that I'll show you is all the same. We pull out examples from the spontaneous speech. We run a mixed effects model to tease out the effects of the known predictors of the pattern. And we look to see whether generation or ethnic orientation remain as significant predictors of these finders, so of these variables. So for case, there's a number of different grammatical factors that determine what case is prescribed in particular contexts. And so we simply had the research assistants who are speakers of these, of Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian, go through the transcriptions, finding every noun phrase that was not prescriptively nominative, because there's no variation when it's prescriptively nominative, and code for whether and code what case was actually used. And then we determine whether the case that was selected and the case that was prescribed were the same or not, and we call that a match. In every single context, the match was the majority form chosen as well, so we can think of it as just choosing the majority versus any minority form as a binary dependent variable. And I think I could skip over the examples, but here's just super quickly. In this case, the word cards is an object. The prescribed case is accusative. The observed case is also accusative. So that token was coded as a match. Here, the noun time, because of a special rule, requires the genitive in Russian, but the speaker used the nominative form. And so that was a mismatch. So looking across all nouns and pronouns that were not prescriptively nominative across the data that was available for 3 languages, for the 3 heritage generations, and comparing to homeland, we see a pattern like this. So on the one hand, we do see that in successive generations, there are higher rates of mismatch, and this this climbs for each of the languages. However, it's a far cry from the 87% mismatch rate that was reported by Polinsky in a study of severely attrited Russian heritage speakers in the United States. So again, we see a divergence between the experimental findings and the corpus-based variationist approach. moving on quickly to talk about variation between overt and null subjects, which I'm going to refer to as pro-drop, but I only mean it in the subject context. We haven't looked at objects. We know that in many of the languages that are part of this project, subject pronouns are optional. They are virtually categorical in English. We say virtually because, in fact, in the corpus of English that we checked, we found a 98% overt pronoun rate, and we did find some cases of null pronouns. Some of these were null subjects where the referent was the same as in the previous sentence, and so everyone agrees that, yeah, that's pretty okay to leave the pronoun out. But we also found cases where the subject, which was null, had a referent which differed from that of the previous sentence. And these have been described as ungrammatical, but they do exist in spoken English to some extent. And so when we look at this variable in the heritage languages, we want to check whether the factors that influence the choice between overt and null subjects are becoming more like the factors that influence this variation in English, as well as looking at just the overall rate of null subjects and whether that is decreasing from generation to generation. So I'm not going to take time to talk about the specific factors in this case, only to say that we coded for a number of different factors and we compare them to the factors. We look for change, and if we find change, then we see whether the change is towards a grammar that's more like English, where the referent being the same as in the previous sentence or not, and the clause type, whether it's a main clause or a conjoined clause, are the only two factors that influence the choice of a null or overt subject in English. The most recent analyses that we've done of pro-drop have been for Cantonese, where a number of factors have come out significant. We're not going to worry about these numbers today because the important thing is that the factors that are significant and the direction of the effects and the relative size of the effects is the same when we analyze the homeland speakers separately from the heritage speakers. And even when we split between first and second generation heritage speakers, all of the same factors are contributing to whether the speaker produces or omits a subject pronoun. And similarly in Korean, exactly the same story. When we compare the homeland to the heritage speakers, exactly the same factors have an effect. So we don't see very much evidence for change in pro-drop when we look at spontaneous speech, where speakers are able to choose what grammatical constructions they want to use, rather in contrast to experimental studies that do grammaticality judgments or forced choice tasks or elicitation type things, where we do see reports of increasing use of overt pronouns in a number of heritage languages. So here we're just looking at the rates of pronoun use, the distributional results, and we can see that for most of the languages, there's not very much difference between the homeland, the first generation, and the second generation. Interestingly, for the two cases where we do see a change between the homeland and the heritage language, in the case of Russian, we seem to have uncovered a change in progress in homeland Russian towards a decrease in the use of null subjects. And also in FIDAR, there's an age-graded effect in the homeland variety as well as in the heritage variety. But the other thing to keep in mind here is that there's a 20-year gap between when I collected the homeland data for my dissertation research in the early 90s and when we collected the heritage data much more recently here in Toronto. And so that could also be, since it is a change in progress, could also account for these differences. But otherwise, we see consistency between homeland, first generation, and second generation in both the rate of use of null subjects and the grammatical conditioning. So these results replicate, for null subjects, replicate findings reported in many variationist, that is, multivariate analysis studies of heritage Spanish in the United States, where no effect of contact emerges, and they counter findings that have been conducted again in the United States, again with spontaneous speech, but where monovariate analyses, that is where only one factor at a time is considered, and experimental studies that do reflect evidence of language contact. So for voice onset time, for case marking, and for null subject variation, we've now seen different types of results emerging between experimental and variationist studies. And in each case, we see less effect or less evidence for contact-induced change in the sociolinguistic approach. So to kind of put that in a slightly bigger picture, since I don't have time to present the data from all of the different variables that my super busy team have been looking at, I'll just briefly summarize what we're learning so far about contact-induced change via this corpus or variationist approach. The conclusion is that contact effects, well, we don't find so much of them when we compare heritage to homeland varieties in variationist analysis of spontaneous speech. So we started out by looking at voice onset time. In this graph, an S indicates that the heritage and the homeland variety are the same. A D indicates that they are different, but only a D with an exclamation mark indicates that they are different, and we can attribute the change to contact with English. That is, there's a change towards a more English-like pattern. So when we look at just voice onset time, we have kind of a mixed bag. When we look at case, it did turn out to be true that all three of the languages showed differences between heritage and homeland for both their rate of matched case marking and the constraints that condition it. And for null subjects, in contrast, we find quite a bit of similarity between homeland and heritage in total similarity in 4 of the languages that we've looked at. We find a small differences in constraint effects for 2 of the languages, but they are not effects that can be attributed towards contact with English. So those are the 3 we just looked at. Additionally, we're looking at vocabulary choice, and we're not seeing any evidence of English influence that is incrementally increasing generation by generation. And we've also looked at classifiers in 2 of the languages, and we have a mixed bag there. So overall, about half of the variables that we've looked at show consistency, stability, and about half show some kind of change going on where the heritage language is diverging from the homeland, but only a very few of those are differences that could be attributed to contact with English. So obviously we still have a lot of cells to fill in. We have other rows that we're developing as we look at intensifiers, as we look at different phonological features, and as we look at final deletion patterns. We hope to have more to fill in and to get away from this 50-50 of what changes and what stays the same. The goal being to address these long range questions, which I will leave you with 3. Is it possible to make cross-linguistic generalizations about the types of features, structures, rules, or constraints that are borrowed from English into a heritage language earlier and more often? And if it's possible, what are those generalizations? And on the other side of sociolinguistics, to ask how social factors are relevant. There's a growing set of publications that mention that the usual suspects like gender and social class that have been important in the description of so many variables in North American English are not playing as big a role when we look at bilingual speakers. Perhaps the fact that speakers can switch from one language to another offsets the need to make such narrow distinctions in how they speak within either one of their languages. But one of the questions we're interested in is whether the same types of speakers lead changes in both of their languages or all of their languages. That is, the young female of the second highest social class has been kind of hallmarked as the leader, the innovator for change in North American English. But so far, we don't see any evidence of that in the data that we've looked at in heritage languages. And another question that probably many of you are wondering about is why these results differ from the experimental studies. And I'll leave that, I think, I have one, I'll take one more minute and just go through. One possibility is that we're really looking at different samples. So this people who live in Toronto live in a society with quite a different attitude towards multilingualism and even immigration, I dare say, than many of the studies that have been conducted in the United States. So it may be that the samples of the people who live in the two places are actually different. Sorry, I've switched these two around. The populations may actually be different, but in addition, we may sample the populations differently in that we are looking in this study for speakers who are able to speak for an hour in their heritage language. And most of the experimental studies are seeking speakers who are not completely fluent in order to be able to see what difference that makes. It's also possible that the different methodologies are directly responsible for the different findings. That is, experimental tasks tend to feel more like school test kind of things, and they're often conducted in a classroom or in a lab. So they're bringing heritage language speakers into a place where for their whole life, they've been told that the dominant societal language is the appropriate language, and they're being asked to use their heritage language in this context to do things that are not like activities that they normally do in their heritage language. And that in itself might have an effect. And the actual physical or psychological context of the data collection may have some sort of an effect. And of course, there's the possibility of standard language ideology, the idea of an expectation of the right way to speak for heritage languages still being associated with that homeland variety. Could play a role differently in the two types of tasks. So I'm really excited that this month, working with Annabella Ratu, we are starting in on something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. So we have a team of Tagalog and Portuguese speaking research assistants who will be selecting speakers and having them engage in both a sociolinguistic interview and in a couple of experiments so that we are controlling, we're looking at the same sample of the same population, but we have different methodologies, and we're really looking forward to understanding what that can show us about whether in that case, we get the same kind of results from the two methods or different kinds, because that will help us start to narrow down what the cause is of the differences that have been becoming more and more of a trend as we look at more and more data in this project. So I will close by thanking the research assistants who have participated in the project already and are responsible for what I've been able to share with you today. Thank you all. I look forward to your questions. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Naomi. So I think I'm going to be sort of moderating the questions here. I'm Maya Ravindranath Abtahian. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Rochester, just across the lake and a national border from Naomi. So I'll start with, I'm going to read the questions and then I will partly paraphrase them, I think. So please, if I've misinterpreted your question, go ahead and respond in the chat, in the comments again on the video, and I can re-ask it. So the first question is, that you've considered a monolingual, could any sociolinguistic orientation still expect to find any place or community that's not multilingual or multicultural, mainly in a digital humanity, in a social network space of interactions and mobility? So I'm sort of interpreting this to ask, I think, if we consider that there's this monolingual bias in sociolinguistics, is it the case that that bias is artificial and in fact there really are no spaces, either communities or digitally, that are not multilingual or multicultural?
That's a really nice question. Thank you. I think it is the case that more and more we have a globalizing world, and people do have exposure to multiple languages, but I think there's still quite a big difference between using a globalizing language like English for long distance media communication, as opposed to using it every day for your most intimate connections in your day-to-day work. So I think we do still have places where people are multilingual, but we can kind of measure how much they use or are exposed to the language that is not their own first language. And I would expect to see effects of that difference. So that's certainly the case in this project for particularly the Cantonese speakers where the homeland sample is Hong Kong, and the Tagalog speakers where the homeland sample is Manila. That English is widely used in those communities, but it's still used far less and for a far narrower range of activities or registers than it would be used here in Toronto.
Thank you. I hope that answered the question from the questioner. So actually, I'll skip one and ask a related question, which is, do you have majority English data of the heritage speakers, or did you interview them only in the heritage language?
For this project, we interviewed them only in the heritage language because there already exists 2 large-scale projects here in Toronto looking at English of different groups. I mentioned Hoffman and Walker's group because that's the methodology that we appropriated for our project, but also Sally Tagliamonte has been collecting data on Toronto English for a number of years. So those samples exist. And the Hoffman and Walker, in particular, their project is organized by ethnic enclaves. So we can look at not the identical speakers, but speakers from the same communities, and possibly some of the same speakers, but the research ethics requirements of privacy about the speakers means that we can't actually know whether the same speakers appear in both studies.
Thank you. So then there are 2 other related questions about language policy. The first is there any strategic state vision regarding the use or reuse of this type of research project to design linguistic or educational policies?
I think it would be great if this kind of research could inform educational policy. I have no training in educational policy, so I would hope that the results could be shared in ways that would be usable for people who are involved in that area. And I would be really happy to talk to people about that. We have discussed developing little kind of outreach modules to take to heritage language Saturday schools and talk about some of our findings, and to talk about the idea of the standard variety, which is always the homeland variety, in opposition to the local variety. So something a little bit modeled on what Wolfram and his colleagues have done, where linguists go in and they talk to the students, but by talking to the students, they're actually hoping to influence the perspective of the English teachers who are lurking in the background in the classroom, and get them to realize the validity of the different ways of speaking that the children bring into their classrooms. So we're hoping to develop something like that in the near future.
Thank you. And I think that answers the next question, although you might have something more to add. The question is quite simply, how can your research contribute to language policy discussions?
There's not a lot of language policy discussion, as far as I know, about using local models versus international models for in education. I think it would be really nice if that could be started, and I would welcome any suggestions on how to get some traction in opening up the dialogue to allow that to happen. But in Ontario, there's not a lot of federal funding for heritage language education. So most of it is done on a local community by community basis. So it's it would be quite difficult to impose any sort of policy or even influence policy broadly, because there isn't any kind of a structure overseeing the way heritage languages are taught.
Thank you. So there's a question about non-heritage language speakers. So is there any study of the perception of Canadian speakers who do not use the languages investigated on the heritage languages? Thinking that there's a coexistence of these speakers, presumably that there might be some shared attitudes or shared perceptions or different perceptions, I guess.
I'm not aware of any studies directly of non-heritage speakers on heritage speakers speaking their heritage language. With Nicole Hoffman, James Walker, and Ronald Belin Mendez, we have been looking at attitudes of both heritage and non-heritage speakers to the English produced by heritage language speakers of several different ethnic groups. We found some really, we've asked speakers first whether they can identify what ethnicity a speaker is, and then how well they think the person speaks English, whether they think the person could be a Toronto local. I think one other question that I don't have in my head right now. And the interesting thing is that the responses about how well they think someone speaks and whether they think they're local are very tied to what ethnicity they attribute to the voice clip that they hear, but not to the actual ethnicity of the speaker who produced the voice clip. And there's people are not actually very good at identifying through their English what ethnicity a person is in Toronto. So that's as close as I know of existing to the kind of research that's being asked about.
Thank you. So there's another question in the chat. Commenting first that the size of the languages studied in this project is relatively high compared to other, there are other smaller immigrant language communities in Toronto. So that this means maybe that these speech communities that you've studied have already established a sense of society in Toronto. What do you think about studying any of the smaller languages that are heard here and there in Toronto?
So we do have one small language. We have one language that only has about maybe stretching to 200 speakers in Toronto, in the greater Toronto area that we've looked at. If funding could be found, I would be happy to add more languages to the project, but it's important that there be 3 generations of speakers of a language. So that has been one limiting factor as we've thought of some other languages to add to the project, is whether we would be able to find enough 2nd and 3rd generation speakers to make a valid enough sample to be able to do the kind of work that we want to do. I will point out that in addition to the size of the community, there's sort of the age of the community in Toronto, and about half of the languages that we're looking at have had a community of speakers for over 100 years in Toronto, and the other, primarily due to immigration laws in Canada that didn't open up until the 60s, have only been here for about half a century. And so far, we're not seeing any strong effect of either the size or the age of the community, but with so much variation, we really do need to look at more variables before we can do that, stepping back and making the kinds of generalizations. So to add other languages in, if funds can be found, or if there are people who want to volunteer to collect the data, which has been a really successful way that we've collected quite a bit of the data that is in this project, and there are 3 generations of speakers, then I'm very, very happy to share the materials and methods and expand outward.
Thank you. So the next question is again about the data, whether the speakers were controlled for whether both their parents are speakers of the heritage language or only one parent speaks that language.
Right. Ideally, both parents are speakers of the heritage language and came from and either they or their grandparents came from the same place in the homeland, so that we can also control for regional variety. In some cases, we haven't yet been able to find quite enough of what we call ideal speakers, that is, ones that satisfy every one of the criteria that we've set. And so in the meantime, we have recorded some speakers who have only one parent that is a speaker of the heritage language in question, but they did speak the heritage language as their first language growing up at home. And if we are able to find speakers that better satisfy the criteria, then we'll add them into the corpus and eventually kind of shift out the ones that are only close to perfect.
Thank you. So I think please, if I haven't covered questions in the chat, just put it in again. I think I've read through them. I have a question of my own that I'd like to add. One of the reasons I think this work is really interesting and exciting is because it contributes both to the literature on language contact and sociolinguistics, but also, phonetics and documentation and language endangerment and shift. And particularly with respect to documentation, I know there's been some ongoing discussion about diaspora communities and whether documentation in diaspora communities is, I don't want to say legitimate, but whether it has the same results as, say, doing language documentation and description in homeland communities. And I wonder sort of whether you think, when we see, for example, the Russian, Ukrainian, and Italian differences in VOT, and, so that we are seeing these kinds of differences in the different communities. I'm wondering how you think your work, sort of responds to this question of benefits and drawbacks of working in diaspora communities, doing documentation in diaspora communities.
So one benefit is the fact that we can look at different languages while controlling for the context and the methodology better, so that our results cross-linguistically are more comparable. I think that, how can I say this? How long a language has existed in diaspora is a really kind of political issue. I don't think anybody questions the study of English and French and Spanish in North America, for example. But if we kind of went back in time, at some point, those were speakers in diaspora. And at what point did they become legitimate communities on their own? I don't think sociolinguists want to say it's not legitimate until the government decrees that the language is the official language. And so outside of that, I think we want to study languages in as many different contexts as we can while the languages are spoken. And in some cases, it's easier to access the diaspora community. It's easier in particular to train researchers in a consistent way, say, through a big institution like the University of Toronto, to be able to look at different languages and also to be able to go back and collect homeland data that wasn't available in a more consistent manner than would be possible if we had the projects in existence separately in each of the homeland varieties. And Maya, I know that you have worked on projects collecting data in different countries using consistent methodology. I think there's also something to be said for having insider field workers, so people who are local to the community, both for recruiting the participants and for the kind of a rapport that develops during the interview by two people who have so much shared background. That in my own experience doing field work in Italy versus here in Toronto, I see a big difference in how much I feel like an outsider in my own research project when there's so much difference in background and so many things that I don't share with the participants. And I think that can be sort of maybe a negative in developing rapport, but a positive in being able to notice things that are really, really different. So I guess I don't feel like there's a clear motivation either to or not to study languages in diaspora, but I find it hard to really say what that distinction is in cataloging particular varieties.
Thank you.
Does that answer it?
Yes, yes. And yeah. I mean, I sort of, I agree with you. Well, but I was curious to hear what you had to say about it. Are there any other questions I can answer in the chat? Or I cannot answer.
You can probably
iterate. All right, I'm going to ask one more question if that's okay. So, and it's really just reiterating, in this case, the question that you put in your slides. I'm curious what you think, whether it is possible to make cross-linguistic generalizations about the linguistic constraints on contact effects.
Yeah, so I'm just like so excited to get more data and to be able to answer that a little bit more empirically. It is interesting to me, for example, in the ProDrop work that we've done, that we've sampled from languages that are kind of traditional ProDrop languages like Italian and other languages that have been categorized by syntacticians as operating quite differently, and yet the like Cantonese, where we have no verbal inflections that distinguish person and number, and so there's supposed to be quite a different process of requiring or allowing the omission of subject pronouns, and yet we find a fairly consistent set of factors influencing the variability across the languages that we've looked at. And so and those are linguistic factors. And then, as I've said, we really haven't seen much change going on for ProDrop in the heritage varieties. And where we have seen it, there's also change going on in the homeland. So this is one case where we've looked at 6 languages, and 2 of them have a change in progress and the other 4 don't, but they might have at some other time, or they might in the future. So I think it's as I think about it, it's hard to generalize, because there's no reason that the moment we choose to collect the data should be the moment when the change is ongoing in a particular language. And so it's really more a question of, if there's a change ongoing, then do we see consistent factors influencing it? But we certainly can't, for example, conclude that ProDrop will change in contact with English, because in 4 of the languages in our sample, it's remarkably stable. And in the 2 where it is changing, it's not because of English, because it's also changing in Moscow and in Faeto. So I feel like we don't yet have evidence from this project to really be able to answer that question. I could pull out some of the results and answer it yes, and I could pull out other results and answer it no. So I'm trying to hold off on taking a stand until we collect more data or analyze more data. We're doing well on the collecting. Yeah, but the analyzing is slow, right? Because we require heritage language speakers who have the interest and the time and the ability to analyze each variable. And those come up at different times for the different languages. And so this will keep us busy for quite some time. I'm happy with that.
Thank you. So thank you, Naomi, very much for this lecture. And thank you to the organizers. This is really, Linguists Online is an amazingly diverse and distinguished series. And I really enjoyed participating and listening to it. So thank you very much, Naomi. I think I can say thank you. And
thank you. And thanks again to the organizers and to the audience. And for my students that are here, the Jackman students, I will see you at 10:30.